Welcome to Bunny Hugs and Mental Health, the podcast that deals with all things mental health. We talk to professionals, survivors, and loved ones about their sometimes informative, sometimes uplifting, and sometimes tragic stories. I'm your host of the show, Todd Rennebaum, advocate, recovering addict, experienced sufferer of depression and anxiety, and author of the children's book, Sometimes Daddy Cries. Hello and welcome to another episode of Bunny Hugs and Mental Health. I am Todd Rennebaum, and this week we have another very interesting guest, but I have a little business to talk about before that. First off, I'd like to thank my sponsor for this week. It's Penny University Bookstore. Their address is 3104 13th Avenue in Regina. Their phone number is 639-571-2186. Go in, see the lovely Annabelle, buy all the books, or if you don't like talking to people or going to places, you can go onto their website, pennyu.ca, and you can just order the books right there. I also want to give a couple plugs, a couple shout outs. One plug is for Teen Talk Tuesdays on Zoom. You can go to www.lauralawrence.ca and register there, and every Tuesday night you talk about mental health stuff with teens, and it's just a really great service and a really great Zoom meeting. I spoke on it a few weeks back. You could you can just Google Laura Lawrence Teen Talk Tuesday, or you can call 306-864-7060. One more quick plug. This is for a fellow podcaster. It's Hard Knocks Talks with Daniel Unmanageable. He talks to quite a few people. I'm not sure how many episodes he does a week, but he's a fairly busy guy at it. He's got lots of followers. Lots of people following him. And it's on, I think it's a YouTube video mostly. And he talks a lot about addiction, mental health, all types of great stuff. Super busy guy. We went to the same school. Yeah, there's a plug to Daniel. One more quick thing. I just want to say thank you very much for everyone that's been listening, leaving messages, nice, kind words, been sharing stuff. It all really means a lot. Especially I want to thank Orland and Trina Thompson. They left some very lovely words and shared some lovely stuff about the podcast. And they, like everybody's got their own issues, and they have family members going through stuff, and they just appreciate that this podcast is out and talking about that kind of stuff. If you want to leave me a message or a comment or a question or whatever, you can do that on Facebook at Bunny Hugs and Mental Health, or you can go onto Instagram, Daddy Cries Book. That's my handle for that on there. And I look forward to hearing from you. Anywho, this week's guest is Kara Fletcher. She just did some research on addiction and language. What the type of words we use when talking about addiction. It's a really great study, super interesting, and as someone in recovery, especially interesting. Just a little warning, again, I get a little ranty about addictions and the stigma and a little bit of what the government's been doing lately here in the province, so just keep that in mind that, those are my own opinions, but it's not too bad. So anyway, without further ado, I introduce to you Miss Kara Fletcher.
I'm an assistant professor at the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Regina. I'm based in Saskatoon, and I'm also the director of the Social Policy Research Center.
So, Kara?
Yes.
With your study, can you just explain what how your study worked and what it was that you were really researching?
Sure. So I looked at the experiences of both people accessing outpatient treatment for substance use and the clinicians that worked with those particular individuals at that outpatient treatment center. I was looking at how they understood and felt about language around substance use, particularly as it related to relapse and recovery.
And first off, what inspired you to do this study?
So I actually worked in the field for quite a few years, and between graduate programs and across, in both in British Columbia and Quebec and now in Saskatchewan. And what I had noticed in my practice was that people living with substance use issues really felt kind of targeted and stigmatized by the expectations placed upon them, both by society and by treatment centers. And I found actually working particularly, I worked at a treatment center in Quebec for a while that was residential. And I felt like the folks that were accessing treatment there were kind of treated like they had done something wrong, that they were being punished. And so that kind of translated to how they felt about themselves. So that kind of inspired me to ask more questions and learn about, what's it like for people accessing treatment for substance use, and what's their interpretation of how language is used and how they feel about that.
And what were your findings?
My findings were...
I know it's an hour-long video, but...
No, yeah. So my findings were that essentially the words we use to talk about substance use and substance misuse really matter. And so if we're constantly framing things in terms of clean time and calling people addicts and junkies and abusers, that starts to impact how you view yourself and your journey. And so you start to define yourself starting with your addiction, as opposed to defining yourself as a person who happens to have an issue, a legitimate health issue as it relates to their substance use.
Do you think addiction is a mental illness?
That's a good question. I think substance use, like I do think there is something like that makes sense to be defined as a substance use disorder. I think it is absolutely under that umbrella of a mental health issue.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think that it's not that simple, right? Like all of a mental health issue is complex, and a substance use issue can be existing with an anxiety issue, a trauma history, a struggle with depression. It can kind of, I think our desire to constantly categorize and compartmentalizes people, and can cause, I think, a bit of a issue over individual problem. So we're not really seeing the person as the person, we're seeing the person through the kind of diagnosis or the issue that we perceive them to have.
Right. Do you think the language kind of perpetuates the whole stigma of addicts?
Yeah, totally. I do. I think that it sets up what's different from addiction from, I would say, any other mental health issue is, and at least now, I think there's been some evolution here. Not to say it was always this way, but I think what still stands apart is that addiction is very much viewed as a moral failing and an issue with the individual, that they didn't make good decisions, that they didn't try hard enough, that somehow it's their fault that they have an addiction. And so I think, the language that we use continues to perpetuate that myth.
Right. I don't know if you know, but I'm in recovery myself.
Okay. No, I did not know that.
Yeah. And I actually work at the treatment center that I went to.
Awesome.
We're closed right now because we had a fire. I think I say this every week on this podcast, but we tried to open up in another small town, and actually people of the town actually signed and started a petition and sent it to
Yes, I did hear about that.
Yeah. It was heartbreaking.
No kidding.
Not just because people need the beds and I need a job, but just knowing that the stigma is so strong and alive in some places in Saskatchewan still, that I don't know, they think, I don't know what they think.
That
they think they're criminals.
somehow having a treatment center in their community puts them at some sort of risk, which actually is just untrue.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very sad.
And actually, when I was in treatment, it's at Pine Lodge Treatment Center. I mean, it's old school treatment in there. Like, it's like you see in the movies where they get in your face, and it's really, aggressive, I guess. And the language is, I mean, it can be harsh at times for sure. Do you think that kind of treatment is still, I don't know what the word is, legitimate, I guess?
I think I have complicated feelings about that, because that was similar to the place where I worked for a while just outside of Montreal. And I found it kind of, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and, work your program and the rest will follow. And I think that approach works for some people. My issue is that that's not a one size fits all approach. And so if you're someone with a significant trauma history, for example, I think there's a real risk of creating further harm in having a punitive approach to wellness. Like, I think generally, there's different things will work for different people, and that's okay. But I think we need more treatment options, more that are trauma informed, more that focus on, also understanding why does someone develop a substance use issue? Can we look at that from a social context? Can we look at that from a systemic context where we consider things like race and class and access to resources and, what kind of environment did you grow up in, and how does that impact, what you do to take care of yourself along the way? Because I do think we don't start out using substances to harm ourselves. It's often started in an effort to self-medicate, to escape, things that might be very legitimate depending on the situation in which you're living, right? So do I think we should write off all of those kind of harsher treatment centers? No, not necessarily. I think some people get great benefit out of that kind of treatment. But I think, pretending that that's the only way, or buying into this idea that that's the only way to help people, I think is not, it's not true. And we see with success rates out of a lot of residential treatment programs in Canada, they're not great. They're pretty low. So it really suggests to me that we need to consider other options as well.
Yeah. Our treatment center, so I've been told anyway, has a pretty good success rate, but I mean, I'm sure every treatment center probably thinks that, but
I think you hope that you do, right? And I think short term, a lot of places do, but if you check in 6 months later, a year later,
right,
2 years later, the statistics anyways aren't great in terms of what we currently have for offerings in the country.
Especially this last year.
Yeah.
We've had a couple different directors come in the last few years, and they have kind of switched up the programming. So it has gotten a little softer since I've been in there. But I 100% agree with you that there is no one size fits all for treatment.
Yeah.
Like, I've seen people, after the first few days leave, and they just couldn't handle that much, in your face kind of, they're a lot more passive kind of people and whatnot. And so even amongst the counselors, there's, this talk about what program would work best and that. And I don't know, I've always thought maybe we should have 2 or 3 programs running at once. Some people work better, that way, and other people work better with the trauma. And anyway, it's really tough because, like you said, everybody's different. So
absolutely. Yeah. And I think if you had a significant trauma history and someone's yelling at you, and in your face about your recovery, I think that does that kind of, that can be quite activating in a harmful way for some people. That can be re-traumatizing, even though it's done with the best of intentions. I think there's risk there as well. So yeah, I think it's about really trying to think about how do we tailor interventions and treatment and support to the individual, as opposed to just trying to have these this is the way to do treatment, right?
Right. And that's, I mean, we're going a little past the language now, but it's good to know that you work in addictions, because I can't ask these other questions.
Yeah, sure.
So I noticed in your, like, you had a video, you had done like a Zoom, I don't know what you would call it, a symposium? I don't know what it was.
It was a talk for the Alumni Association at the U of R.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's on YouTube now, and I watched it, and I noticed that even in the 12-step programs, and for myself being in a 12-step program, I noticed sometimes even the language in those can be a little, I wouldn't say troubling, but, I kind of wish the language was a little different. What were some of the people that in recovery mentioned about the 12-step programs language?
Yeah, so there was actually quite a bit of commentary on the 12-step program and the study results. And I guess not too surprisingly, because it was folks who were accessing like outpatient counseling. So some of them were doing that instead of going to a 12-step program, and some of them are doing that along with going to a 12-step program. But I think some of the things that people expressed as challenging was just some of the language that's used and the expectations. So if you're in the program, you're familiar, statements like 90 meetings in 90 days. Well, to some people that's exciting, that's motivating. And that's like a way to make a real commitment to their well-being. And for one of the guys I spoke to, he said like that just made him basically want to run away. Like, you failed before you started, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And
it's a lot of expectations to put on a person who's fresh in recovery.
Yeah, totally. And then this idea that like, if you just quit drinking or using, your life will get better. And a couple of them said, no, that's not true. Like, if I quit drinking, I'll just be miserable and sober, or miserable and not using. So like that they found some of those sayings, like if you work the program, the rest will follow. And how much clean time do you have? So then as a result, just some of those kind of cultural expectations of the 12-step group, which from my understanding, really differ group to group and sponsor to sponsor, how those things get talked about. But the kind of, I think those expectations, people in the study were saying, made them feel like, if they relapse, they are coming back with their tail between their legs, as opposed to like relapsing is a very normal part of a recovery process. So why all the shame and kind of guilt associated with it, right? So there were quite a few examples, honestly, that were interesting to me, because I've worked with people for years now who have found great benefit in the 12-step program, and then people who, like, kind of what we were saying before, not everything works for everybody. People who found the kind of setup of it quite pathologizing and judgmental. So really drastically different accounts of what that looked like for different people.
Yeah, I can imagine, because some of the stuff you're saying, it doesn't apply to me at all. But like you said, there's so many different groups and whatnot. So generally speaking, in the meetings I've ever been to, it's they encourage you to come back whether you've relapsed or not, and there's no shame in it at all. And the coffee's always on and all that stuff. So that's too bad that some people are having that experience in 12-step groups. But again, I know too that they're like I said, I mean, it's not one size fits all again. So for me, I don't know if you got this in the research or in the study, but for me, the word God, that language of God in the AA thing, was kind of turned me off a little bit at the beginning. But it's for lack of a better word, is what I was told from my sponsors. So, higher power and all this stuff was, it's up for interpretation, the word God kind of thing, is what he told me. So then that made me feel better. But if you're coming in there cold into a meeting and you're like, they're usually held in church basements and stuff.
Right. Yeah.
You think you're joining a cult or something, but
yeah. Well, that's funny that you say that, because I did hear that a bit in the study, and then I've heard that from clients over the years, like big time. And so, yeah, the reinterpretation of that piece of it, higher power. I've had clients think about it as like aiming to be their better self, like how they kind of restructure that in their head if they're not someone who that word God fits for.
right.
But yeah, certainly that could be another barrier. And something I think people either readily accept, struggle with, and can't accept, or like you're saying, learn to integrate in a way that works for you, right? So
yeah, working more in the treatment center, there's a lot of people that have been in the program for years and they come back, they've relapsed or whatever, and they come back. But there's a lot of people that have no idea about AA, or they've never been to treatment before. And I found that, I mean, this is just my own observation, not any research or anything, that the person that grew up in church and they went to church every Sunday or whatever, they're the ones that have the hardest time with the word God, because they already have this kind of thing in their head when they hear that word. And it's the people that didn't go to church, when they hear the word God in the program, that, that they were like me. They just kind of made their own interpretation of it, and they were kind of okay with it.
Totally. Yeah.
How does one change this kind of language and have it catch on? Like, you know what I mean when I'm asking that? Like, how do you start to change the language around addiction?
I think you start with yourself, right? And how you talk about addiction, and how you talk about people who use drugs or struggle with their substance use. I found, like, as someone who researches substance use and misuse, I've had to be pretty careful in terms of, like, if someone's writing an article about a study that I'm doing, often I find when I get the kind of proof of what they're about to print, like they've phrased it as addict, or it's been phrased in a way that I'm not comfortable with. And it's kind of funny, because I did an article back in January on how much language matters, and and then going through the proof of the article before I published it, the editor had made some interesting changes that kind of put in negative language again. I was like, no, that's the whole point of this article. So I think we have to kind of unlearn the ways in which we have consumed and integrated information about what it means to have a substance addiction. And so we can start with ourselves, just trying to be considerate and thoughtful about the words that we use. And then we can have those conversations with the people in our lives that we love, and the people in our lives that we share information with. So hoping that it kind of extends beyond ourselves. I try to do, like, I teach at the university, I try to model it in the language that I use with my students, in the things that I write, in the things that I talk about, all in hopes that, it'll kind of trickle down, and that we're constantly trying to challenge these social stigmas and understandings of addiction.
Yeah. I was thinking about this the other night when I was coming up with the questions, and I thought, I think a big help would be, like, I don't know how you get everybody on board, or you just fax all the different addiction counselors in the world and say, okay, this is the new language now.
Yeah.
So using it like this, and like you said, like teachers, when you're teaching in universities and whatever, social work and whatever, kind of start there with the new language too. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not that we intend harm, right? But I think that we are so inundated with this, like, image of what it means to have a substance addiction, and how we talk about people who do, that we forget, the human who's living that reality, and we forget how harmful those characterizations can be. So yeah, I think, like, I also think of it as, like, person first language, which helps me, like, let's talk about the person as opposed to their problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So instead of the word addict, have you come up with something that you think would work better?
Well, I talk about it as someone who struggles with their substance use, a person who's uses drugs. Really depends on the context and the individual. If
Mm.
I'm working with someone and they refer to themselves as an addict, I will sometimes ask them about that, like, why do you refer to yourself as an addict? And for some people, that's actually an important self-labeling. And then we talk about like how they would like me to refer to them. And usually they don't want me to call them an addict, right? Which makes sense. But we talk about, language ownership, and how if I was going to talk about them from the perspective of their substance use issue, I would say something like, oh, my client who's currently struggling with an addiction or with their relationship with crystal meth or whatever, right? So
Mm-hmm.
talking it out that way, but that there's also that is one part of that person. That is not all they are.
Right. And that's another thing in the 12-step groups, that they kind of, you introduce yourself in every meeting and, hi, I'm Todd and I'm an alcoholic.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And some people find that empowering and kind of like owning that aspect of themselves and saying that. And other people feel really compartmentalized by that. Right. So yeah, I
Depends
think
on the day for me.
yeah, very fair, very fair. Yeah. I think to me, it's less like, I think we should be able to call ourselves whatever we want, right? It's as long as we're not harming someone else in our own characterization, which I think is kind of hard to do. But
Yeah.
I think it's really important that we are mindful in terms of how we talk about the realities of other people. And I think it's also really okay to say, like, how do you want me to talk about this? How do you want me to talk about you? Because, especially in a counseling context, you might be advocating for someone you work with another organization or with another counselor or something like that. And so you might want clarity on how they would like to be talked about. And I think that's respectful to do it that way.
Mm-hmm. I guess the only, I don't know, I was going to say maybe the only benefit is that at that point they kind of take realization and that they are struggling with this.
Sure. Yep.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely. But I also think that's an individual journey, right? Not for someone else, not for me to tell someone else how to label their journey.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the clients I work with, man, the language they use is way more harsh than the counselors use.
Yeah, totally.
But they're amongst, I guess, suffering peers, so it's different, I guess. Maybe. I don't know.
And sometimes I think people find that especially when you're in, like you said, when you're amongst peers who are having a similar shared experience, I could see how that could be maybe helpful to use harsher language that more accurately reflects like how their reality, right? But yeah, I'm less worried about how someone who's living an experience of addiction characterizes their experience than I am about how people who know nothing about it talk about it. If
Right.
that makes, you know what I mean? Like that's my concern. And I think the way the media, the way politicians frame substance use is very stigmatizing.
Speaking of politicians' language.
Yes.
Prairie Harm Reduction had a letter writing campaign after the provincial budget.
Yes.
So they didn't get any funding from the province, so they had everybody write a letter to some of the ministers. Mm-hmm. And so I did that, and I got a letter back, and I just want to read you a couple sentences and see what your thoughts are on the language. Okay, so addressing the negative impacts of substance use and misuse is an ongoing concern. Our government funds a continuum of alcohol and drug misuse services. Now, as someone who's done some research, how do you feel about that language?
I mean, I guess I don't find their particular language terribly harmful in those two sentences, but it doesn't actually reflect the reality of what they're doing. So, and to say that they fund a continuum, well, obviously they don't. They're not funding safe consumption sites. They are making a political statement by not funding prairie harm reduction. And so if you're talking about funding a continuum of substance what it was the language continuum of,
where did I put it here? A continuum of alcohol and drug misuse services, and then the sentence goes on to say other things, but I just took that snippet.
Yeah, but that's not funding a continuum. I think they fund a very narrow definition of what is a treatment for addiction. So,
trust me, I was mad when I sent my first letter, and then I was even more mad when I got this letter.
Yeah.
There's some other language in there where it's like, what are you talking about? That's like, they said something about best practices, and it's like, oh my God.
Well, and that's just not true, because we actually know that safe consumption sites are best practice for harm reduction. We have a very robust body of literature and research that backs that up. So that to throw around best practice and deny funding to a safe consumption site is pretty ridiculous, in my opinion.
Yeah, man, you're preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
I actually, in one of my past episodes, well, actually it was the day after the budget came out, I talked to Jason McCurdy, the director of harm reduction, and there's more swear words in that episode than any other episode.
I believe it, and Jason has every right to swear about it.
Yeah.
It's pretty unfortunate.
Was it about a week ago? A bunch of people put up crosses on the legislative lawn, and each cross symbolized the person that has died of an overdose in, I think it was just Regina.
Yeah.
And the numbers were staggering compared to Saskatoon. And the only difference is...
Wonder why.
Yeah. One has a safe consumption site.
Yes.
Yeah. It's very frustrating. Yeah. I could go on for 3 hours complaining about this stuff, but...
Absolutely. Me too.
For me, the language in the statement, it's the word misuse that drives me nuts.
Okay.
Addressing the negative impacts of substance use and misuse, and then our government funds a continuum of alcohol and drug misuse services. I was like, I mean, how do you properly use crystal meth? I don't know. Like when I think of the word misuse, it's like I'm misusing something, and it's there's a negative impact on that word for me anyway.
Well, to me, that's interesting, right? And that's why it's so important to have these discussions, because I think that the catch-all of use and misuse started to be used, I think, in an effort to capture the fact that not everybody who uses drugs, particularly illicit drugs, has a addiction to the drugs that they are using. And so, or they don't identify, there's lots of folks who don't identify that they have an addiction to particular drugs. And so I think that was used in an effort to move away from this kind of like this language of substance abuse. Right. And, but I appreciate your perspective, right? That misuse doesn't fit for you. It doesn't really make sense. I'm using them
properly. Like, I don't know.
Right. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about it that way before. That's why I think we maybe don't have a perfect way to talk about addiction, right? And so I think we should all be participating in this kind of evolution of language and be thinking about, how to use words that aren't harmful to others, but also capture the experience, right?
Right. Yeah. Like for me, the word misuse, I mean, I don't know if it's a negative impact. It's unnecessary to me. I don't know. It's just like, it's a good point, and one I hadn't thought about. It's like someone who obviously doesn't have an addiction wrote this. I don't know.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Is there anything else? Is there any other research or any other projects you're going to be working on soon?
Yeah, so I am actually I'm working with Jason Mercady through Prairie Harm Reduction and Choke Cherry Studios. And we're going to actually be starting this summer a youth-led podcast about crystal meth and lived experience of drug use in Saskatoon.
Beautiful.
So we have funding for the project, and it will be led by youth in the community in an effort to basically, pass the mic to people who are living the experiences of, the impact of crystal meth in Saskatoon and other drugs in general, and just they'll interview a variety of community members, and it will be really led by them. But the goal is essentially community engaged research, and the importance of actually hearing from people who are living the realities of drug use and addiction in our communities, because I think too often policy and everything is developed without actually talking to the people who are impacted the most. So so that's one project that I'm starting this summer, and also we're in the middle of a project right now where we're actually interviewing people who've accessed mental health and addiction services through the provincial health authority, and to see what's helpful in that experience and what could be changed, because we hear a lot about long wait lists and barriers to entry in terms of like the intake process. So we're just going to try to get a better sense of what's working well, and what could be done better.
I know what doesn't work well is having a fire.
Yeah, right? No kidding.
One of the things in the budget, they said they're giving Estevan 12 more beds for treatment center. But meanwhile, we have 30 beds that are not being used at all. So,
wow.
Who's funding the that project with the podcast?
So the Saskatchewan Health Research Fund is funding the one with the Health Authority, and SHIRK is funding the podcast project.
What's SHIRK?
SHIRK is the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. It's federal funding. Yeah.
Speaking of funding, after that, well, I know you're quite aware of it, but I just find it amazing that the city of Saskatoon, after the provincial budget came down and they gave $0 to Prairie Harm Reduction, the community got together and like less than a month raised $180,000 for them.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
It's amazing. And I think it's both amazing and deeply tragic, because it's amazing that the community stepped up in that way. And I mean, Prairie Harm Reduction has been or fundraising with T-shirt sales and like the things that they've had to do to kind of keep this program going or this site going. And then to think that the government now in some ways gets off the hook. That's the part I find tragic. It's like, wow, the community rallied. So, here the government's like, well, here we go.
Why fund it when
the community will take care of it?
Yeah.
And that's pretty sad, I think. And I wish the government was actually hearing about that and actually thinking, wow, if it matters that much to the community, this is clearly a vital service we ought to be funding. And I think the thing that really makes me angry about all of this is back when there's so many things that make me angry about it, but back when the election was underway in the fall, there was the debate between Mo and Ryan Miley, and that question got asked about funding the safe consumption site, and he said that they would consider it. And they actually also had, I'm sure you heard, they had a report citing all of the positive research behind having a safe consumption site. And still with all of that information, and kind of, letting on that might happen as a bit of an election ploy. And they didn't do it. I just think it's disgusting. But
I don't know how you can have a minister of mental health and addictions, but not fund a consumption site.
Exactly. No, it's absolutely ludicrous. Yeah. I
Yeah.
I
The
shake my
thing,
head.
the whole thing about that too is the $180,000 that they raised. It wasn't even a campaign. Like, they have fundraising campaigns that they do, like the shirt
Yeah,
sales and all that
yeah.
stuff.
No,
This
it
was
was just
just the community got together and said, "Holy shit, these guys do awesome work." This
yeah.
is not about. I mean, this it's not about left or right or
No.
ideologies or anything else. Like, and they got. I mean, there was a study done that was any people under 35 was something like 90% supported used consumption sites. So
Absolutely. I
I don't
don't get it.
understand it.
No, it doesn't make any sense. It seems to be an effort to appeal to a particular population that votes for the SAS party, and I don't get it. Like I think I don't understand, because like you're saying, there is wide support. People who understand harm reduction support safe consumption sites, and I think it's deeply disturbing when at the bottom line it's like, well, we don't care that people will die as a result of this decision, and that to me is deeply, deeply troubling.
Well, the other thing I don't get is governments are always about the bottom dollar and whatever, and it's like the research is there that proves that this actually saves the government money by funding these places. So
Absolutely it does.
you're
Absolutely
going
it does.
out of your way not to save money to not fund them. Like
Yeah.
anyway, I don't get it.
Yeah, I don't get it either. And the money that they were asking for was just like a drop in the bucket for their overall budget of the government. So
Yeah, but they're patting all their backs because there's going to be possibly one open in Regina, but they don't tell you that they have nothing to do with it. All they have to do is give them a thumbs up.
exactly.
Yeah, we put our thumb up, so there's that.
So yeah, and they're gonna have an overdose prevention society, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I know. It's really
Anyway,
yeah.
so it's more than just language. Yeah, like the language from government, from our top officials, to even the language of our Minister of Mental Health and Addictions by not sponsoring these things is perpetuating the stigma. It's like that's like the opposite of harm reduction is by
Absolutely, because what they're saying is we don't care. And that is, I think that's probably almost worse than saying we don't agree with it, or, for like having some sort of argument. They don't care. And that is so troubling. How do you not care about the people who live in your province?
yeah.
Yeah.
So no wonder there's a lot of shame and guilt and things felt
Absolutely.
by well, I'll say addicts because I don't know what other word to use.
Yeah.
I don't know. It is weird. I don't know if I like being called an addict or not, or if I mind. I should say. I mean, I don't like it, but I think the only reason I might not like it is when I think of an addict as like really hardcore street drugs. But I know that that's not what it means. A drug is a drug is a drug, and my addiction was marijuana and alcohol. But yeah, that's a tough one. The word addict, and good research. Well done. It's a real.
Well, and I think it is truly harmful drug policy that has made this, like, that also, like, kind of what you're talking about, that hierarchy of drugs, right?
Yeah.
Where like somehow it's more socially acceptable to be addicted to alcohol than it is to be addicted to crack cocaine. Why is that, right? And that's because the policies we've placed around the drugs. It's not the drugs themselves, and it's the fact that we continue to have toxic supply. We don't have safe supply of drugs, and so that's why people are dying.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think that term addict, right? When they say addict, they probably don't. What comes to mind for a lot of people, like you say, is this hardcore street person using drugs on the street, right? In an alley or something. Like, that's what comes to mind. And I think that characterization even if that is what someone is doing, suggests that they are less than somehow because that is what they are doing. And I don't think that they are less than. I think that there's lots of legitimate reasons behind why they choose to do what they're doing. And I don't know where I'm going with that, but yeah, to say that certainly like that word addict, I think is more stigmatizing depending also on what drugs you're using.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why people like Chief Evan Bray, I love his language around addiction, because he's part of this chief group, or group of chiefs, police chiefs that are trying to legalize, or at least decriminalize pretty much all drug possession.
Yeah.
To end exactly that stigma that we're talking about right now, where it's, so you're not looked at as a criminal anymore. You're just looked at as a person with a mental health issue.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, that's a lot of things to change.
No kidding. One day at a time on that.
Yeah.
Thank
God we have a minister of mental health and addictions to help us with that.
Right. Yeah. Don't hold your breath.
I should just start a political podcast instead of a mental health one.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Hey, they're deeply intertwined.
Thank you very much, Kara, once again for all your knowledge and for just having the guts to do this kind of research and this kind of study. As you can see, the language we use really does affect the person that is ill. It can really perpetuate the stigma. It can really cause people to keep using, actually, between the shame and the guilt and all that kind of stuff. One thing we didn't talk about, but is in her study, is she talks about people in recovery and people relapsing, and how there's no kind of real in between. You're either in recovery or you're relapsing. When in fact, there's harm reduction that's kind of in the middle. So it's, people that are using, they know it's dangerous, they know they need help, so they're either on Suboxone or methadone. They're trying to quit, that kind of in between. They're not full out using, but they're not in, abstinent recovery. Also, of course, when you think of harm reduction, you think of people using in harm reduction facility. So, yeah, that was kind of an interesting thing that I forgot to ask her about. But, yeah, I really, really appreciate Kara and her study. Now, next week, it might be a bit of a surprise, because I do have a interview lined up with someone who just came out as trans in time for Pride Month. And, all the mental health issues and the addiction and all that kind of stuff in the queer community. Hopefully that works out. If not, it's something else. So it might be a bit of a surprise. But yeah, tune in next week. Either way, it's going to be an interesting guest. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe, rate, and review however you are listening to this podcast. It only takes a moment, and it really helps the show out with getting noticed. This episode has been sponsored by Penny University Bookstore, 3104 13th Avenue. Call 639-571-2186 and check out their online bookstore at pennyu.ca. And Regina Plumbing and Heating. Call 306-585-2000 for all your plumbing, heating, and cooling needs. If you are having a mental health crisis, please call the Canadian crisis number at 1-833-456-4566. In Saskatchewan, the mobile crisis team in Prince Albert is 306-764-1011. In Regina, it's 306-525-5333. And in Saskatoon, it's 306-933-6200. Don't forget to check out my children's book, Sometimes Daddy Cries. Sometimes Daddy Cries is told through the eyes of a boy whose father suffers from depression. He sees his dad get sad, rest, and even go to the hospital, all while comparing his father's depression to a physical ailment. Available on Amazon.ca. I'll see you next time. This is Todd Redebaum saying, make your beds and take your meds. Bye.